This story took place when I was a junior at university, around 21 years old. At the time, I was pursuing 2 majors simultaneously, and to graduate within 4 years, I had to register for 6 courses each semester. This meant that I was almost always buried in a mountain of assignments and studying. On top of that, I was also working part-time as an intern each semester, leaving me with almost no free time to study. The university library stayed open until midnight, and it became the only place where I could go to focus on my studies. One Wednesday evening, after finishing a long day of 3 classes and my internship, I decided to head to the library to prepare for 2 upcoming exams the next day. When I arrived at the library at 9 p.m., it was still quite busy, but within an hour, the place started to quiet down as people gradually left. I chose to sit at a table between 2 bookshelves, creating a more private space for myself to focus. I planned to stay until midnight to make sure I could cover all the material I needed for the exams the following day. Around 11 p.m., only a few scattered people remained in the library. Suddenly, a man in his late 20s walked into the area where I was sitting. What was strange was that, despite plenty of empty tables nearby, he chose to sit right at the table across from me, slightly diagonally. I looked up as he placed his books on the table, and he smiled at me. A feeling of unease started to rise within me, but I tried to ignore it and kept my eyes on my laptop screen, trying to focus on my lecture slides. A few minutes later, he suddenly spoke up, asking me if I was studying a specific economics course. I politely answered no, hoping the conversation would end there. However, he went on to explain about his professor and the daily pop quizzes he often gave. I replied with a short comment that sounds really tough and tried to refocus on my work. But my mind was no longer on the material. His presence was distracting me, and I had a feeling that he wasn't going to stop there. I glanced up from my screen again, and this time, he was smiling at me, but it was the kind of smile that sent a chill down my spine. I started to consider leaving, but I didn't want to make things awkward. Then he asked for my name. Not wanting to give my real name, I made one up, Alice. He looked at me for a moment and then said, "Alice, you have such beautiful blue eyes." I started to feel genuinely anxious. It was clear that he wasn't there to study, but for something else. I asked for the name of his economics professor to see if he was actually a student here. After a few moments of hesitation, he replied, "Professor Davis." Feeling suspicious, I quickly looked up the name on the Rate My Professor website. The only result for a Professor Davis at our school was a math professor who hadn't taught in years. My sense of unease intensified, and I decided to stand up and walk toward the security guard at the front door. I could clearly feel his eyes watching me as I walked to the security desk. I explained the situation and expressed that I didn't feel safe. The security guard immediately followed me back to my study table and asked the man to show his student ID. He started rummaging through his wallet and pockets, then said he had left it at his dorm. When asked which dorm building he stayed in, he hesitated and eventually said he couldn't remember the name. The guard asked him to leave the library, and after he stepped outside, the security guard came back and advised me to be careful on my way back to the dorm. Even though I felt safer after he was escorted out of the library, my mind still couldn't focus on studying. All evening, I kept thinking about his strange behavior and wondering what might have happened if I hadn't alerted the security guard in time. Around midnight, I decided to close my books and get ready to head back to the dorm for some rest. I left the library, and although I didn't see him anywhere nearby, I still felt uneasy. I started walking along the mostly deserted campus path, silently praying that nothing would happen. However, as I neared my dorm, I suddenly heard footsteps behind me. I turned around, but saw no one. I was certain I had heard those footsteps, and the feeling of fear started to rise within me. I decided to run toward the dorm, but as soon as I started running, I heard footsteps behind me, matching my pace. When I turned around, I saw it was the same man from the library chasing after me. I screamed for help, but only managed to yell for a few seconds, before he tackled me to the ground and covered my mouth. He threatened to kill me if I made any more noise, and at that moment, I truly believed I was about to lose my life. In desperation, I struggled and tried to scream, but my cries were muffled by his grip. He started dragging me off the main path, toward the wooded area near the dorms. That's when I realized I needed to act immediately. With all the strength I had left, I managed to free my mouth and scream again. My scream was loud enough to catch the attention of two passers-by. They ran over and shouted at him to stop. As soon as he heard the voices of the two people, he let go of me and ran into the woods. The two who had come to help asked if I was okay, but I couldn't respond right away as I was still in shock. They called campus police and stayed with me, helping me stay calm while we waited. When the police arrived, I recounted the entire story, and they took me back to the library to confirm the description of the man with the security guard. The police retrieved footage from the library's security cameras and sent out a campus-wide alert about the incident. Just a few hours later, an anonymous tip came in reporting that the man was at a nearby bar. The police went to the bar and arrested him that same night. This experience left a significant emotional scar on me. I was fortunate to escape that dangerous situation, but I can't imagine the suffering of those who weren't as lucky. After that night, I became extremely cautious whenever I had to walk alone at night, especially around campus. When I was a child, I always had an irrational fear of the basement in my house. To be fair, the basement was quite scary for a kid. It was a large space, with an L-shaped sofa right in the middle of the room, facing a wooden support column. In front of the sofa was an old TV where we connected all our gaming consoles. The layout of the basement was designed like a big circle surrounding the sofa. In one corner, there was an old bar with a door behind it leading to the laundry room. The corner closest to the stairs was the entrance to my dad's small workout room. Our house was divided into 2 floors, and my dad had rented the upper floor to an elderly woman named Ruth, so our family only used the ground floor and the basement. My dad usually sat in the living room on the ground floor, which is why all our gaming consoles were connected to the old TV in the basement. Since the basement was rarely used, it often felt a bit isolated down there, which added to the unsettling atmosphere. As the youngest in the family, I had 2 older brothers. When this incident happened, I was only about 7 or 8 years old. My brothers weren't home that day, they were probably out playing with friends. It was just my mum and me at home, while my dad was at work. Normally, I would play video games with my brothers in the basement, and with them around, I never felt scared. But that day, I had to go down by myself. As soon as I started descending the stairs, I began to feel a bit uneasy. The basement door had an annoying habit of slowly closing on its own, unless something was propped against it. This made me feel even more isolated from the rest of the house and my mum upstairs. I sat down on the soft, grey, fluffy sofa and started playing my favorite video games at the time. However, every little sound in the basement made me pause and look around. The basement always had strange noises coming from the laundry room, and even though I was used to them, I still couldn't shake the feeling of fear. But the sound I heard this time was unlike anything familiar. It wasn't the usual noise from the washing machine or the furnace. It was the sound of something falling to the floor, bouncing a few times. I couldn't stay calm any longer and rushed up the stairs to find my mum. I told her that someone was in the basement. She remained very calm and asked me what had happened. After listening to my story, she reassured me that no one was down there. To make me feel better, she decided to check the basement with me. She opened the laundry room door, turned on the lights, and looked inside for a few seconds. Then, she closed the door and told me that there was nothing unusual. I felt more at ease and returned to the sofa to continue playing my game. A little while later, I went upstairs for a quick snack. When I returned to the basement, it was already dark, making the space down there even more eerie. During the day, the light from the two small windows in the basement helped keep it from feeling too gloomy. But at night, the entire area was plunged into complete darkness. Even so, I continued going down there. But this time, I heard the furnace in the laundry room turn on, except the sound was much louder than usual. When I turned around, I noticed the laundry room door was wide open, even though my mom had closed it earlier. I began to feel uneasy. I walked closer to the laundry room door, but inside, it was pitch black. I didn't dare turn on the light. I just wanted to close the door quickly. Summoning all my courage, I ran to the door, slammed it shut, and rushed back to the sofa. Strangely, I didn't even think about how suspicious it was that the door had opened by itself. After sitting back down on the sofa, the most terrifying thing happened. I heard a man's voice from behind me. At first, I couldn't process what was happening. My mind seemed to freeze. I turned around and saw a thin, pale man sitting in the corner, with his hand resting on the table and his head leaning on his fist. He said, "Oh my, how you've grown." I was completely frozen. I couldn't scream, couldn't move. I just stood there, staring at the man in the corner, my mouth open but no sound coming out. He slowly stood up, his posture crooked, and began walking toward me. "Your mother doesn't let me see you," he muttered. Finally, I snapped out of my terrified state and screamed. I bolted up the stairs, yelling "Mum." As I ran, when I reached the kitchen, I slammed the basement door shut and locked it, crying as I told my mom about the man in the basement. My mom, equally frightened, immediately called the police. I don't remember much about the moments that followed before the police arrived, only that there were many officers going down to the basement to investigate. They found the man. It was my uncle, my mum's brother, someone our family hadn't been in contact with for a long time. He had been estranged from the family due to the crimes he had committed, and no one wanted any connection with him. No one knew how long he had sneaked into the house and hidden in the basement. I didn't recognize him at all, because the last time I saw my uncle, I was just a baby. After that incident, my uncle was arrested and had to serve additional years in prison for another crime. We never heard anything about him after that. October had arrived, and the crisp autumn air was everywhere, bringing with it the familiar scent of dried leaves and long afternoons. My boyfriend, Andrew, and I had just moved into a new house, and this was our first fall living together. To surprise Andrew, I decided to decorate the house with autumn and Halloween-themed decorations before he got home from work. I thought this would make him feel warm and cozy. I started looking for a few items at local stores like Target and Home Goods. However, I also browsed websites and apps for secondhand decorations, and while searching on Facebook Marketplace, I came across a very enticing listing. It was a picture of a large orange plastic container filled with autumn decorations. The post read, "Clearing out entire box of full decorations for cheap." The price was only $15, and the box was packed with all sorts of decorations, from tablecloths to outdoor ornaments. The seller, as I saw in his profile, was named Tom. His profile was quite private, with all information set to private. His profile picture was a photo of a grey baseball cap, and the cover photo was a blurry image of a mountain. I messaged him to ask for more details about the items in the box, and he replied immediately, saying that everything is in the box. When I expressed my desire to come and check it out and buy it that same day, he agreed but mentioned that he would only be available after 8 p.m. because he had to work. The address he sent me was in an area that wasn't too far away, but it wasn't exactly the best part of town. I decided to invite my best friend, Mia, to come along for added safety. After picking Mia up, we drove to Tom's address. On the way, Mia joked about the area we were heading to, saying it seemed a bit sketchy, but we laughed it off, thinking it was just excessive worry. When we arrived, the first thing we noticed was that there were no cars in the house's parking lot. The lights inside the house were dim, and the windows were all covered with curtains. I messaged Tom to let him know we had arrived and asked if he could come out to greet us. Both Mia and I suddenly noticed that one of the curtains had slightly parted, as if someone was watching us from inside the house. Then, just as quickly as we noticed, the curtain closed again. A moment later, Tom messaged me saying that he was at the door and we could come in. I felt really uncomfortable at that moment, but Mia and I decided to approach the house anyway. I called out Tom's name as we got closer to the door, but there was no response. When I called out again, louder this time, a man finally appeared, peering out just halfway from behind the door. He waved us in and said, "Come on in." Our anxiety increased as we stepped into the house. The door opened to a dark space with a strange odor that smelled like an old place mixed with the scent of something rotting. As we entered the living room, the dim yellow lights illuminated the old furniture and a faded red carpet. In the middle of the room was a red plastic box, but it was clearly not the orange box I had seen on Facebook. The man, now standing next to the box, urged us to open it. I felt uncomfortable with the situation, so I asked him to open the box himself. He looked at us and said, "You're no fun." That comment made Mia and me start backing away toward the door immediately. But then he opened the box, and a horrible stench hit our noses. Without thinking, Mia and I turned and ran out, not stopping until we were in the car with the doors locked. After recounting everything to Andrew, he was worried, but also curious to check out the address of the house. I warned him not to go there, but he insisted he would just look it up. The next day, Andrew came home later than usual, and said he had stopped by that house. However, when he knocked on the door, an elderly woman answered and claimed that she lived there alone. Nonetheless, Andrew believed that I wasn't making anything up, as I had shown him all the messages I received from Tom, including the address of the house. When we looked up information about the house, it turned out that it was indeed owned by a woman in her 60s. This made the entire experience even more puzzling and eerie. Since then, I became extremely cautious when shopping online and always avoided meeting up with sellers I didn't know. I grew up in an old house, built in 1900, located in a quiet neighborhood. It was the kind of house that, even on sunny days, the atmosphere around it still felt heady, as if the house held on to memories it didn't want to let go of. When I was a child, I didn't pay much attention. It was just the place I lived. But over time, strange things started to happen, making me reflect on the boundary between what is known and what cannot be fully understood. Everything began when I was about 11 years old. One afternoon, I was home alone. My dad was out at work, and my mum was tending to the garden outside. I was sitting in the living room, lost in thought, when suddenly I saw something that made my heart race. A complete shadow, shaped like a man, entirely pitch black, wearing a hat similar to Abe Lincoln's, though not as tall, walked across the hallway wall. There were no details, no face, just a solid black figure. My initial reaction was disbelief. The house was old, so perhaps I had missed it due to the lighting, or maybe my imagination was playing tricks on me. After all, people often say that old houses are full of peculiar things, but this time it felt different. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself that there was nothing unusual. Yet, that image stuck with me, like a bad memory that wouldn't fade. It wasn't until many years later that I learned about a phenomenon called the Hat Man. Apparently, this is a phenomenon often reported by young girls and women, a menacing black figure usually associated with homes that have negative energy or a history of domestic violence. The strange thing is, my family wasn't a dysfunctional one, but there were certainly moments of tension. My father was a very skeptical person, always dismissing anything related to the supernatural. In his mind, ghosts didn't exist, and that was the end of it. But what I saw that day was only the beginning of experiences that made me question everything I thought I knew about the world. The house seemed to have a will of its own. Sometimes, objects would suddenly move without any clear reason, even flying across the room. I would be sitting at the kitchen table, either doing homework or eating, and suddenly, something would fall from a shelf or the table. At first, my parents dismissed it as vibrations from passing cars, or simply the house settling due to its old age. But as these events became more frequent, they became harder to ignore. The truly terrifying part was my bedroom. Even from a young age, I felt that something wasn't right about that room. I refused to sleep there, no matter how much my parents insisted. It just felt wrong. The air in the room had a strange heaviness that I couldn't explain. My dad, of course, often teased me about this fear, laughing and saying that ghosts aren't real. One night, to prove that I was wrong, he decided he would sleep in my room by himself. I remember the next morning clearly. I woke up thinking my dad would boast about how he had conquered my imaginary fear. But instead, I found him sleeping on the couch in the living room. Not only that, but my bedroom was suddenly decorated with a series of portraits of Jesus and several crosses that hadn't been there before. It seemed that overnight, my dad had tried to ward off something he refused to talk about. I asked my dad what had happened, but he was tight-lipped. All he said was that he found the couch more comfortable. But I knew better. This was the man who had spent years mocking my fears, and now he had covered my bedroom in religious symbols. It wasn't until many years later, after we had moved out of that house, that my dad finally told me what really happened that night. He said that at first, he went to bed completely at ease, almost amused by the challenge of proving I was scared for no reason. But in the middle of the night, he woke up with a strange feeling. He described it as the sensation of one of our cats crawling up his leg. But when he looked down, there was no cat. He brushed it off and tried to go back to sleep, but then he felt something else's blanket was slowly being pulled off the bed from the bottom corner. It wasn't a sharp tug, but a deliberate, slow movement, as if someone or something was intentionally doing it. The blanket fell to the floor, and that was enough for my dad to leave the room and never sleep there again. My father admitted that, at first, he thought it might have been a case of sleep paralysis, a common explanation for experiences like this. But what puzzled him was the real, tangible feeling of it, and the fact that unexplained things had happened in the room when we were fully awake. That night marked a turning point for him. The biggest skeptic I knew suddenly became a believer. He didn't talk about it often, but his attitude toward the supernatural had undeniably shifted. After we moved out of that house, my parents sold it to a single woman. A few months after she moved in, she called my mother, asking if we had ever had any issues with the house being haunted. My mother hesitated, not wanting to scare her, but eventually admitted that, yes, we had noticed some strange things from time to time. The woman told my mother that she had set up her bedroom in the same room that had once been mine. But after a few nights, she found it so unsettling that she had to move to the living room to sleep. I am not a spiritual person, and like my father, I consider myself a skeptic when it comes to things like ghosts or the supernatural. But there are things that are hard to explain. What happened in that house, what we experienced, was real, even though we haven't fully understood it. To this day, I can't say for certain what caused those strange occurrences, but I know I didn't imagine them. It wasn't just me. Even my father, the biggest skeptic, had his own frightening experience. And even the new owner of the house felt something similar. Maybe it was just the quirks of an old house, or maybe something darker was at play. Either way, I've come to accept that some things simply can't be explained easily. That house, with its creaking floors and shadowy corners, held secrets that I might never fully understand. But one thing is certain. I will never forget the feeling of seeing that figure move across the hallway wall. And I will never doubt the reality of what we experienced in that house. This story happened when I was about 21 years old, on my way from the city back home after a business trip. The drive home was quite long, nearly 7 hours of continuous driving. At that time, I decided to drive through the night because I couldn't afford to book a hotel for the night due to limited funds. It was a decision I never thought would leave such a lasting impression, as I had never felt so scared and anxious in my life. The first part of the trip went quite normally until around 10 p.m. when I was driving on a quiet highway between two small towns. I noticed that there had been a car behind me for a while, but at first I didn't pay much attention to it. I told myself that the driver was probably just heading in the same direction as me, since this road had very few travelers late at night. However, after about an hour, I began to feel that something was off. The car kept following me, maintaining a distance that wasn't too close but not too far either. This made me uncomfortable. I reassured myself that the driver was probably just coincidentally going the same route. But when I stopped at a small gas station to buy coffee and recharge for the rest of the trip, the car also stopped across the street, just sitting there without anyone getting out. At this point, I started to feel confused and anxious. Why had they stopped without any apparent reason? I quickly went into the gas station, bought what I needed, and left. When I got back in my car and continued driving, the car followed me again. The sense of unease began to grow, but I tried to stay calm. I told myself it might just be a coincidence, that they would turn off somewhere or stop soon. But that didn't happen. The car continued to follow me for nearly another hour. It was close to midnight when I pulled into a rest stop to use the bathroom. What truly terrified me was that the car also stopped, but they remained parked at the entrance to the rest stop, and no one got out. There was no movement at all from their side. At this point, I started to panic. I didn't know what their intentions were, but I was certain they had been following me for quite some time. I tried to calm myself and think of a solution. I decided to test whether they were really following me. After leaving the rest stop, I purposely turned into another stop, not far away, but didn't stay there long. And just as I feared, the car followed me again. This time, they stopped on the opposite side of the road, still not getting out of the car. The situation was becoming terrifying. At this point, I still had about 2 hours of driving left to get home, but the feeling of unease kept growing. I decided to call my parents and tell them the whole story. Both of them were worried and advised me to be cautious. My dad, who was usually very calm, told me to drive to a central area of the city and make 4 turns to see if the car would continue to follow me. I followed my parents' advice and turned into a more populated area. However, every time I made a turn, the car continued to follow closely behind. There was no longer any doubt they were definitely following me. My dad told me to drive straight to the nearest police station. As I approached the station, the car still didn't stop, and only when I signaled to enter the station's parking lot did they suddenly speed off, driving way over the speed limit. I breathed a sigh of relief, knowing I was safe, but the fear and anxiety still lingered. I went into the police station and reported the incident. The officers quickly sent a patrol car in the direction the vehicle had fled, but I never heard any further news about the driver or why they were following me. The only thing I knew for sure was that from that night on, I became extremely cautious whenever a car followed me at night. Even though I'm not someone who usually believes in supernatural stories or eerie tales, that experience really made me think. It wasn't the usual type of fear, not the fear of ghosts or anything paranormal, but rather the fear of what people are capable of when you don't know their intentions. The scariest part was not knowing what they wanted. Questions kept swirling in my mind. What were they planning to do? Why did they follow me all night? And where did they go after speeding away from the police station? I may never get the answers to those questions, but that experience changed the way I approach nighttime drives. Every time I drive late, especially on empty roads, I'm always cautious of any car behind me. Just seeing a car turn in the same direction as me makes me anxious. Even though I don't know exactly what the driver's intentions were that night, the best thing I can do is to always stay vigilant and never ignore that gut feeling when something doesn't seem right.